My automotive heartlands are built up of the cars that do things differently, that reflect an engineer's ideals in flouting convention and becoming curiosities. And today on TwinCam we have a curiosity that turned controversial, where engineering brilliance met relative market calamity in the beautiful, sonorous and ever so interesting Alfasud Sprint. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you fancy driving around in front-wheel drive perfection, then please do follow the link in the description. But what we're met with here is, of course, the Alfasud Sprint, effectively the Alfasud Coupe. So in order to set our baseline, we have the conception and development of what was, to Alfa Romeo, a new, very normal, compact saloon car. So before going anywhere else, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of these truly revered drivers' cars, yet the story that led to their conception takes us back over 90 years, to 1933 in fact, when Alfa Romeo was nationalised by the Italian government. Of course, things can get a little cloudy when a government butts their noses into the running of a car company, but it goes without saying that the politics of this period are sticky at best. In the build-up to the Second World War, Alfa Romeo were being used for their industrial knowledge, the government financing the construction of an all-new factory in which to build aircraft engines. But the reason this matters to us is its location. Not in Alfa Romeo's traditional northern home, in Lombardy to be exact, hence the L in Alfa, but instead in the largely agricultural Italian south, near Naples at Pomigliano d'Arco. Of course, the whole war thing didn't quite go so well, and once the dictator suffered a disagreement with a petrol station, attention shifted to the future of the new Italian Republic. Alfa Romeo remained a nationalised concern, and while their southern facility remained in the background, car production remained firmly tied to the north. However, post-war Europe is best characterised with the word austerity. And with rationing continuing for years in many cases, Alfa Romeo knew that their big luxury and sports cars were maybe ill-advised. In 1954, they debuted the 101 series Giulietta, a car replaced 8 years later by the 105 series Giulia, two early examples of what we'd know today as the compact executive saloon. Both were made available with a little 1300cc engine, which was practical and efficient, yet were suspended by a world-class platform and clothed in gorgeous bodywork. In short, the post-war era gave birth to the compact Alfa Romeo, and as you might expect, they absolutely nailed the brief. Many people in fact regard the 50s and 60s as Alfa Romeo's glory years, and with cars like this, you can see why. Their management, however, wanted to build upon this success, opening Alfa Romeo up to higher levels of profitability, and therefore, a rung down the ladder, a new model planned for the heart of the small family car market. In an ideal world, this is exactly what would have happened. The creation of an all-new compact Alfa Romeo built in Milan to the same standards and ideals as their largest saloons. But of course, Alfa Romeo was still a nationalised concern. And as I mentioned earlier, the Italian government had spent decades funneling money into the economically depressed Italian south, attempting to attract investment and industrialisation that largely did not occur. With a little bit of a nudge from their overlords, therefore, Alfa Romeo committed to building their new car in a new government-funded extension to their facilities at Pomigliano d'Arco. This brings us directly to the badge upon its tail, because this car is an Alfasud purely because it was built in the south of Italy. A decision that politically would define the Alfasud's entire life, and of course we will come back to that later. But as its status as the first truly compact Alfa Romeo, it had to look and feel unlike any car they'd ever built before. In spite of its aforementioned supremacy, the larger Giulia looked in many ways to be a very traditional three-box rear-drive saloon car. Something that may have suited the compact executive, but that just wouldn't wash in a smaller car by the end of the 1960s. In fact, it was Alfa Romeo's compatriots, Fiat, who really proved the supremacy of front-wheel drive, not only in the 128 and 127, but also their preceding Autobianchis that had existed since 1963. Fiat's formula was derived from that pioneered by Austin Morris at the end of the 50s, and as a collective were joined by Audi, NSU, Renault and Citroën by the time the Alfasud went into development. The problem is that no one at Alfa Romeo had any experience in producing a car with such a novel layout. So in chasing engineering purity, they pilfered an Austrian chap named Rudolf Hürsker. Coming over to Milan from Turin, it goes without saying that Hürsker knew all there was to know about the Fiat 128, but the key is that he was a former Alfa man himself, having worked in the previous decade on the Giulietta. But in returning to Milan, Hürsker did not make the Alfasud simply a clone of the 128. Instead, the new compact Alfa was to feel distinctly premium, employing layouts and components that would again thrust Alfa Romeo to the top of the class. The whole point of adopting front-wheel drive is packaging, whereby the engine sits in front of the axle centerline, freeing up acres of space for passengers and luggage. In its accepted modern form, as dictated by Fiat, you start with a simple inline four-cylinder engine, mounted transversely with its gearbox on the end of the crankshaft and uneven length drive shafts transmitting power to the front wheels. And for 95% of the world's population, this is perfect. From an engineer's perspective, however, it has a couple of issues, principal among which is the power delivery. With uneven length drive shafts, the torque is transmitted to each wheel at different rates, causing torque steer that can ruin the driving experience. The solution then is equal length drive shafts, something employed by Austin Morris by way of mounting the gearbox underneath the engine. The problem now is, to a lesser degree, relative complexity, but mainly height. Slinging the gearbox beneath the engine creates a rather tall power unit, which increases the car's frontal area, making it less aerodynamic, and raises its centre of gravity, not good for the handling. With all that said, Rudolf Hürsker designed the Alfasud with an engine layout from another of his former employers, Porsche. But mounted at the front end of the car, the Alfasud appears rather similar to one of its contemporaries, the Citroën GS. Now, unlike all the front drive cars we already discussed, the Alfasud's engine is mounted longitudinally. But this again isn't that unusual. Audi, Renault and Saab were all doing a similar thing, but the latter two of these mounted their engines behind the front axle, totally ignoring all the packaging advantages of achieving front-wheel drive. Audi, on the other hand, decided to mount their inline engine way out in front of the axle, totally ruining its balance. So, especially for this car, Alfa Romeo designed an all-new overhead cam boxer engine, laying the cylinders down flat where they would be very wide, sure, but they'd also be very short, allowing quite a short overhang and maximum balance. By having a flat engine as well, it means you can massively lower the centre of gravity, and as the gearbox is now right behind it, you can have equal length drive shafts. And while it's a little more complex than any inline setup, a boxer engine like this is the ultimate engine layout for a front drive car. There is more, however, because having all that space around the gearbox enabled Alfa Romeo to move the front discs inboard, which may be an absolute nightmare when it comes to servicing, but it allows for better suspension control by reducing unsprung weight. And because the flat engine is that low and because there's so much extra room in the engine bay, it allowed them to fit a second bulkhead, which ties together the two front strut towers, essentially acting as a strut brace, doing wonders for the Alfasud's strength and rigidity, but also insulating the cabin that bit more from noise, vibration and harshness. The Alfasud may appear to be a totally normal small family saloon, but it hails from an era when engineering took precedence, allowing it to become not only a sensible, practical and economical car to go to the shops in, but also a mechanical masterclass. What we witnessed here is the ultimate layout for a front drive car, setting totally new standards for driving dynamics, all in spite of it being the cheapest car that Alfa Romeo had ever produced. Placed beside its layout, the Alfasud suspension was far more expected, yet for its era was still rather novel, especially for a car of this size. At a time when many cars were still using leaf springs, our wedgy friend here has coil springs all round. And just to match the brakes at the front, there are discs at the back too. The front suspension is now a simple set of McPherson struts, a technology that was still relatively rare back in the early 70s, and one that gave contemporary Fiats a great deal of their compliance and control, so it's only natural that Hursker would carry them over to the Sud. At the back, however, we're met by a beam, which may not be as compliant, but with a Watts linkage and its location keeps the rear end really tied down, plus offering a small degree of rear wheel steering. For a small family saloon, therefore, the Alfasud featured a perfectly honed chassis. It didn't go over the top in reinventing the wheel or employing systems previously unknown, instead creating a package that, even with stiff competition, set new standards for engine and handling character when it came to front drive cars. And as a saloon, that is exactly how the car launched all the way back in 1971. Yet it took a further 5 years before, in September 1976, the Alfasud Sprint was first shown. In replacing the lower half of the old Giulia Sprint range, the Alfasud Sprint had a seriously tough act to follow, yet curiously, for the first 6 years of its life at least, this lower and sleeker Alfasud arguably made more sense than the saloon. Of course, the saloon was just that, as most cars in this class were back in period, yet as the hatchback slowly came to prominence, the Sprint was fitted with one from its launch. Meaning that until 1982, the Sprint was more practical than the everyday Alfasud. But curiosities aside, we're met by a small coupe that's very much ahead of its time. In fact, the Sprint was designed alongside the original Alfasud, raising some questions as to why it took so long to actually launch it, but both were the work of the iconic Giuseppe Giugiaro. Compared to his later work, however, the Alfasud Sprint is an aberration. Known for his straight edges and folded paper design, the Alfasud Saloon is very rounded. It sits as a rather tall car, with practical proportions for sure, but they aren't what make it. In fact, the Sud shares its general proportions with the Austin Allegro, which is proof of the value of detail. What makes the Alfasud rather a good-looking car is its simplicity and its focus, but I'd never have said that it was the best-looking car in its class. Certainly not after 1974 and the debut of the Volkswagen Golf. The Golf is important as it too is a Giugiaro design, certainly his definitive work, and one where every single line is perfection. The Golf even belies its size, but it's relevant here as I see the Alfasud Sprint as something of a halfway house between the Alfasud Saloon and the Volkswagen Golf. The Sprint is far more elaborately styled than the Golf, yet with so much more to ponder on, yet its contours are far removed from the bubbliness of the original Sud. It's interesting to compare, therefore, the Alfasud Sprint to some of its coupe contemporaries, and in particular, the original Volkswagen Scirocco. While the Alfa paints such a contrast to its family car counterpart, the Scirocco is clearly cut from the same cloth. And while that creates a great family identity, I feel the Scirocco looks rather less exotic than the Alfasud Sprint. There may be some places in which I believe this car to be a little bit scruffy, but taken generally, the Sprint is an affordable and compact exotic, reflected totally by the manner in which it drives. We'll start with that beautifully raspy engine, because at the Alfasud's launch back in '71, it only displaced 1200cc. Later on, it expanded to the 1500cc that we see in this car, but this is an Alfasud Sprint Veloce, which means it's the hot version. And over the standard 1500, it means you get twin Weber carburetors, one for each bank, and 95 brake horsepower. And in this kind of period in the early 70s, in a car that was considered compact, 95 brake horsepower is really quite a lot. It's certainly not a lot by modern standards, but by the standards of its day, in this era, 95 brake horsepower was really quite a lot. And additionally, we have a 5-speed gearbox here. So again, on the surface, the Alfasud may look like a relatively normal car. When you look at the spec, however, it really begins to shine. And when we kind of take a closer look at the engineering, then it starts to turn into a bit of a thoroughbred, really. We may be kind of sat in a queue of traffic here, but this little engine sounds absolutely immense. It is slightly gruff, but that comes very naturally with its flat layout. Nobody's really surprised in that regard, but it has a sense of flair to it, and I understand totally that that's a proper Italian car swear word, flair. But what I mean in saying that is that it doesn't sound ordinary. It sounds like this car has a little bit of something about it. It sounds alternative, it sounds unusual compared to the standards of its day. And due to its overhead cam layout, it means that it quite enjoys revving. So many engines that I've experienced from this era kind of run out of puff, and so they don't feel like they want to be driven. This does not feel like that, however. And I must say, just while we're here, that this gear change, because it's really quite direct for a front-wheel drive car, has so much feel in it. It is maybe a little bit stiff, but it has so much feel in it. "95 brake horsepower never felt like so much power." And that's the wonderful thing about many older cars, and it's the wonderful thing about being a car enthusiast, because to boil driving down to just numbers, to boil it down to 0 to 60 times, and boil it down to power figures, is to hand your enthusiast card in. There is so much joy that can be extracted from pedaling a car with relatively little power, but pedaling it up to the speed limits that we're allowed on British roads. Because in something that has loads of power, you just cannot extract the character from it. But in this, you can get that engine, that little flat 4 engine, really singing its head off. And it's just a gorgeous thing. The first time I drove an Alfasud, I didn't quite get it at first, because it felt to me like a very competent car, but as a result also quite normal. It didn't feel like that thoroughbred and that game changer that everybody speaks of. it took me a few days to really get it before I realised that this is a car that is well over 50 years old in terms of conception, and yet it feels like a car that could be kind of 20 years old. And that's such a strange sensation. But when you actually look at what you're driving, you realise just how mesmerising this must have been all the way back in the early 1970s. The steering of this car is a bit heavier than I might have expected it to be, but again, that allows you to feel a little bit more of what's going on, and you can tell that it's designed to be slightly sporting because the ride quality isn't all that good. It's a little bit jittery. It's certainly quite firmly sprung. The damping doesn't feel quite as firm, however, which is a little bit strange. Maybe a set of new shock absorbers would get it feeling a little bit better, but of course I can only go by the car that I've got in front of me, and the damping feels a little bit softer than the springing. It's just a little bit curious. But you can tell that it is absolutely designed for the way it handles, and there is such little body roll for a car from the 1970s. That it is so easy to place it on the road, and because it has equal length drive shafts, there's no kind of drag through the steering. There's very little power understeer in this car. It just feels so neutral, and it's so rewarding in a car like this that is simple and that you feel should respond to absolutely every need you have of the chassis. I do have to come back to the engine, however, because I want to talk about what's going on under my right foot. Because the throttle response of this car is absolutely electric. It's unlike any car that I think I've ever drove, in that you end up driving this car just with your big toe. You don't want to put any more force on it because you could very quickly end up jolting down the road in it. Instead, you just want to be so delicate with it. And that's, although there is a lot of weight in the steering, that's kind of what you do with the steering as well. You just kind of direct it and feed it to where you really want to go. And that kind of brings us to the driving position as well, because in front of me is this fantastic 3-spoke steering wheel. Everything is in the right place. The thickness of the rim is perfect. And although it is slightly off-center in this car, I must admit, the placing of the spokes is just perfect. Nice deep dish wheel as well. However, the driving position is what would be described as typically Italian, and that's that your legs are all scrunched up, but your arms are outstretched. You've got to have arms like Mr. Tickle to drive one of these. And that is a little bit like a Metro, so in a weird way I feel at home here, but this is far less competent in terms of its position. Because even though this is a left-hand drive Alfasud Sprint Veloce, the pedals are virtually in the centre console. And from an enthusiast perspective, mesmerising is just the word that would follow the Alfasud around. For decades, these cars have been lauded for their ability and character. Tiff Needell even concluding that it was the best car the 1970s ever produced. But in the actual hands of enthusiasts, an Alfasud is a shockingly rare sight. Never mind a Sprint like this, something that anchors our wider view of these cars today. But before turning to the negatives, I hope we're all on the same page in thinking that the Alfasud Sprint was a wondrous little coupe. But unlike today, Alfa Romeo were a far larger, far more successful company than many people remember. And of course, in the 50s and 60s, the likes of the Giulietta and Giulia were unmatched anywhere else. And so by the early 70s and the Alfasud's introduction, sales expectations were stratospheric. Now sure, they were never going to be on the level of the Fiat 128. Alfa Romeo are a premium manufacturer after all. But you get the gist, especially when it comes to something like the Sprint that's that little bit more niche. These cars wound up being built for 13 years, between 1976 and 1989, in which time they built 116,000 examples. 2 years before this, however, we met the Volkswagen Scirocco, a car that was produced from 1974 until only 1981. So it's 6 years down on our Alfa Romeo here, and in that time, the Germans managed to produce over 500,000 Sciroccos. Bear in mind that this is the very early modern Volkswagen, the post-Beetle era that we know them in today, so that shortfall cannot merely be explained by our perception of these two manufacturers some 50 years after the fact. Instead, I'm afraid there's a lot more going on. A great deal of Alfa Romeo's basic engineering continued in production for decades. The twin-cam engine, designed back in the early 50s for example, kept being used to great effect until the mid-1990s. And the Alfasud's little boxer engine would similarly continue until its replacement by the Fiat-based twin-spark unit in 1997. Indeed, once the Alfasud was replaced in 1983, the new Alfa 33 was essentially the same car, this platform running until 1995. Certainly there was nothing wrong with the engineering that underpinned these cars. Instead, the Sud sowed the seeds for Alfa Romeo's truly appalling reputation for build quality and corrosion. If we return to Pomigliano d'Arco, we remember that the plant had never really produced a car from scratch before. In the early 60s, they had produced Renault Dauphines under licence there, but in the grand scheme of car building, this was barely scratching the surface. When the new plant was built in the late 60s, Alfa Romeo hired a whole 15,000 workers, none of whom had any experience in any industry, never mind car building. Don't forget, this was an agricultural society, one not used to the individualistic and controlled manner of industry. In fact, once the harvest came around, thousands of workers suddenly stopped turning up to work, returning home to work instead on family farms. When cars were produced, they emerged at the kind of standard you'd expect from a workforce not properly trained. Body shells were stored outside, and when brought inside, they still had condensation on them when the paint was applied. The Alfasud's box sections were then filled with expanding foam, which held moisture and caused brand new cars to corrode before even being delivered. So often, however, Alfasuds weren't produced at all. Trades unions in Great Britain get a seriously hard time in the press, but the British unions are total pushovers when compared to the Italians. Though the two were then separate companies, Fiat in the 1970s even suffered bomb threats. But over at Alfa Romeo, there were over 700 stoppages throughout Alfasud production. Any goodwill that had therefore built up as a result of the Sud's fantastic engineering was wiped out overnight. In Britain, this poor quality even gave birth to a rumour, us being happy to ignore the industrial issues while concentrating on our own and theorising without truth that the Alfasud was built with recycled Soviet steel. The story goes that in payment for the rights to the Fiat 124, which of course became the Lada, the Soviet Union supplied steel rather than worthless rubles. This theory immediately falls apart when we realise that Alfa Romeo had nothing to do with Fiat, never mind the fact that the Alfasud plant was supplied with steel from only down the road. Regardless, the damage was done, and the Alfasud's poor quality drove its manufacturer's image into the sewers, where by the 1980s, only a fraction of those who'd have been happy to buy an Alfa in the 60s would ever consider one again. The Alfasud strikes me therefore as a bit of an enigma. This Sprint Veloce is a beautiful, sonorous, fantastic to drive sports coupe, yet it could easily be argued that this car killed Alfa Romeo. In totally destroying their reputation, the Alfasud led directly to their lack of direction as they entered the 1980s, management obsessed with just not upsetting anyone else, and as a result, many 80s Alfas were ill-conceived, which did absolutely nothing at all for their overall desirability, and in 1986, the Italian government was forced to sell the remnants to Fiat. 10 years later, Alfa were back and they'd rekindled their mojo, only to be killed again by quality. And now, 50 years on from the Alfasud debacle, how many more chances does such a storied marque get before the plug is finally pulled? And on that rather sad note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description, and I'll have more videos coming along soon.